Welcome to the Real Free News Podcast. Today, examining why some white Western men view Islam as a solution to perceived cultural emasculation, we analyze the practical realities of Islamic polygamy, jihad, and explores ethnic hierarchies that affect European converts within Muslim societies. In certain segments of contemporary Western discourse, a provocative sentiment has emerged among men frustrated with the perceived emasculation of modern society that converting to Islam might offer a pathway back to traditional masculine privilege. This view contrasts a supposedly vigorous, conquest-oriented Islam, complete with polygamy, easy divorce, sexual abundance, and a martial ethos, with a Christianity that has, in the eyes of critics, degenerated into passivity, monogamous restraint, feminist accommodation, and an ethos of turning the other cheek. The argument presents Islam as a religion tailored for masculine assertion and demographic expansion, while portraying post-war Western Christianity and secular liberalism as doctrines of surrender that leave their adherents defenseless against more aggressive cultural and demographic forces. The appeal is rooted in observable contrasts. Islam is seen as permitting up to 4 wives, and in some interpretations or practices, even more, instantaneous divorce by triple pronouncement, and a historical legacy of military expansion that rewarded victors with wealth, territory, and women. Christianity, particularly in its contemporary Western forms, is accused of forbidding sex outside marriage, mandating lifelong monogamy, complicating divorce to the point of impossibility for men, and preaching forgiveness even toward enemies who intend lethal harm. In this narrative, the modern Christian West appears as a civilization that has unilaterally disarmed itself morally and legally, rendering its men impotent in the face of rival groups who retain a religious sanction for conquest, polygamy, and uncompromising group solidarity. Yet this binary portrait rapidly complicates upon scrutiny. The practical realities of Islamic polygamy, divorce, and martial doctrine deviate significantly from the fantasy version circulated in Western dissident circles. More crucially, the racial, tribal, and ethnic hierarchies that structure real-world Muslim societies introduce a dimension almost entirely absent from the conversionist fantasy. For white European or European-descended men, these hierarchies position them not as equals who can simply adopt Islamic privileges, but as late-arriving subordinates in a system whose core beneficiaries remain Middle Eastern, Arab, or at minimum non-white elites. The following analysis dissects the allure, exposes its factual distortions, and reveals why the proposed solution constitutes a strategic and existential dead end. Part 1. The polygamous and sexual fantasy versus doctrinal and practical reality. The most emotionally charged element of the conversionist argument concerns sexual and marital privilege. Proponents claim that Islam uniquely solves the modern Western male predicament by granting the right to multiple simultaneous wives, ready sexual access within those marriages, supplementary temporary marriages or concubines, and even historical sanction for sex slaves taken in war. Christianity, by contrast, is said to enforce premarital celibacy, lifelong monogamy, and a divorce regime so punitive that men effectively lose children and assets upon marital dissolution. In the Muslim world, merely pronouncing divorce 3 times allegedly frees a man to acquire a new, younger wife without financial penalty. This portrait contains grains of truth embedded in substantial exaggeration. Classical Islamic law does indeed permit a man up to 4 wives simultaneously, provided he can maintain them equitably, a condition so stringent that many medieval scholars considered monogamy spiritually safer. Temporary marriage exists, but almost exclusively within Shi'ism, and is rejected or criminalized by the Sunni majority. The Quranic verses governing concubines and slaves presuppose a state of victorious warfare and a functioning slave economy that has not existed for over a century, Attempts to revive the practice require elaborate theological justification even among the most radical groups and remain illegal in every recognized Muslim state. In practice, polygamy today is overwhelmingly a privilege of the wealthy. Gulf princes, West African emirs, and certain Indonesian tycoons can afford multiple households. The average wage earner in Pakistan, Egypt, or a Western diaspora community cannot. State regulation has further eroded the fantasy of effortless divorce. Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, Indonesia, and Malaysia all require judicial oversight, maintenance payments, and often substantial deferred dowers. The white convert who imagines himself pronouncing triple talaq and walking away unencumbered discovers instead a legal and communal apparatus that can be as punitive as any Western family court when the wife's family possesses influence. Part 2. The Conquest Imperative and the Myth of Individual Jihad. A second pillar of the conversionist thesis portrays Islam as an inherently martial faith that legitimizes conquest, spoils, and the taking of enemy women, in stark contrast to a Christianity that allegedly commands passive acceptance of invasion and genocide. Contemporary Christianity, especially in its mainline Western forms, is accused of reducing salvation to private piety and enemy love while abandoning any notion of sanctified violence or group self-defense. Islam, by contrast, is presented as a religion that still blesses the sword and rewards victorious warriors with riches and captives. Historically, Islam did expand through military conquest, and classical jurisprudence developed elaborate rules for the division of booty, including human captives. Yet the operative legal framework requires a legitimate caliphal authority to declare offensive jihad, an institution Sunni scholarship declares defunct since the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. Without a caliph, most contemporary authorities hold that offensive warfare reverts to a collective duty that cannot be undertaken by individuals or groups. The vision of private Muslims launching raids for territory and concubines lacks any mainstream juridical sanction in the present era. Moreover, the conversionist fantasy ignores that modern Muslim states operate within the Westphalian system and are bound by the same international norms as everyone else. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran do not distribute captured European women to their soldiers because no legal mechanism exists to do so under current interpretations. The martial advantage, then, is largely rhetorical and historical rather than operational. White men who convert expecting to participate in sanctioned conquest discover that the religious justification for such activity is either dormant or monopolized by state actors who have no intention of arming recent European converts. Part 2. The Conquest Imperative and the Myth of Individual Jihad. A second pillar of the conversionist thesis portrays Islam as an inherently martial faith that legitimizes conquest, spoils, and the taking of enemy women, in stark contrast to a Christianity that allegedly commands passive acceptance of invasion and genocide. Contemporary Christianity, especially in its mainline Western forms, is accused of reducing salvation to private piety and enemy love while abandoning any notion of sanctified violence or group self-defense. Islam, by contrast, is presented as a religion that still blesses the sword and rewards victorious warriors with riches and captives. Historically, Islam did expand through military conquest, and classical jurisprudence developed elaborate rules for the division of booty, including human captives. Yet the operative legal framework requires a legitimate caliphal authority to declare offensive jihad, an institution Sunni scholarship declares defunct since the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. Without a caliph, most contemporary authorities hold that offensive warfare reverts to a collective duty that cannot be undertaken by individuals or groups. The vision of private Muslims launching raids for territory and concubines lacks any mainstream juridical sanction in the present era. Moreover, the conversionist fantasy ignores that modern Muslim states operate within the Westphalian system and are bound by the same international norms as everyone else. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran do not distribute captured European women to their soldiers because no legal mechanism exists to do so under current interpretations. The martial advantage, then, is largely rhetorical and historical rather than operational. White men who convert expecting to participate in sanctioned conquest discover that the religious justification for such activity is either dormant or monopolized by state actors who have no intention of arming recent European converts. Part 3. The Passivity Critique and the Evolution of Western Christianity. Critics assert that Christianity has mutated into a feminine, passive doctrine that preaches forgiveness toward mortal enemies and accepts demographic replacement as a moral imperative. The command to turn the other cheek and love one's enemies is interpreted literally and extended to scenarios of lethal invasion, while the earlier Christian history of crusades, colonial conquest, and martial orders is dismissed as aberration or hypocrisy. In this reading, modern Western Christianity offers no temporal rewards, only deferred salvation, while Islam delivers immediate masculine gratification and group dominance. This critique contains a kernel of descriptive accuracy regarding certain liberal Protestant and post-Vatican II Catholic tendencies, yet it overstates both the unanimity and the inevitability of Christian pacifism. Historical Christianity sustained centuries of European expansion, slavery, and warfare with full theological justification. The contemporary Western aversion to violence is better explained by secular Enlightenment universalism, Holocaust-derived guilt, and post-1945 liberal hegemony than by fidelity to the gospel. Orthodox Christianity in Russia and historically in Greece retained a far more martial posture, suggesting that doctrine itself is not the determining variable. The claim that Christianity provides no mechanism for self-protection ignores older strands of just war theory, the right of self-defense articulated by Aquinas and later scholastics, and the continued existence of conservative denominations that reject absolute pacifism. The real shift is political and cultural rather than strictly theological. Western states and churches alike embraced universalism and anti-nationalism after World War II. Blaming Christianity per se for the current predicament conflates a historically contingent ideological configuration with the religion's essence. Part 4. White men and the racial tribal hierarchy in Islam. The reality no one wants to admit. The fatal flaw in the conversionist project lies in the persistent racial, ethnic, and tribal hierarchies that structure Muslim societies and diaspora communities. Despite Islam's theoretical universalism, status within the Ummah is heavily mediated by descent, with Arab, particularly Qurayshi or Peninsular, lineages at the apex, followed by other Arabs, then Persians, Turks, South Asians, Southeast Asians, Sub-Saharan Africans, and finally converts of European extraction, who occupy the lowest rung except in tiny cosmopolitan enclaves. A white convert is not greeted as a brother who can immediately access the full privileges of the system. He is more often viewed as a useful idiot, a potential source of funds, or a political shield. Marriage patterns reveal the hierarchy with brutal clarity. While Muslim men of any background readily marry European women, often converts themselves, the reciprocal marriage of Muslim women to white male converts is exceedingly rare outside westernized elites. Mosque leadership funding networks and informal authority follow the same gradient. Front rows, microphones, and decision-making power accrue to those with the correct pedigree. The white convert who expects to be treated as an equal discovers instead that his European origin marks him as perpetually subordinate, however devout he may become. Historical precedent reinforces the pattern. European populations that underwent mass conversion under Ottoman rule, Bosniaks, Albanians, Pomaks, retained their phenotype, but remained politically and culturally subordinate to Turkish elites for centuries. None produced caliphs, grand viziers, or ruling dynasties. Only the collapse of the empire granted them autonomy. As long as a broader Muslim polity endures, Local converts function as second-tier citizens at best and disposable auxiliaries at worst. The notion that white men can simply appropriate Islamic privileges without submitting to its internal hierarchy is a fantasy refuted by every observable Muslim social order. Conclusion: the truth about converting to Islam for multiple wives. The fantasy of converting to Islam as a solution to Western male dispossession collapses under examination. The sexual and marital privileges are far more constrained than advertised. The martial option is legally dormant for individuals, and the racial tribal hierarchies place European converts at a permanent disadvantage. Far from offering a ladder out of emasculation, conversion inserts white men into a system whose core beneficiaries regard them as inferior latecomers whose women remain desirable spoils, and whose loyalty is exploited until no longer useful. The imagined harem, the effortless divorce, the sanctioned sword, all dissolve into bureaucratic regulation, financial incapacity, and ethnic gatekeeping. What is sold as liberation is revealed as a transfer of allegiance from one universalist cage to another whose bars are forged from centuries-old Arab and tribal precedents. The underlying crisis, demographic decline, familial disintegration, and the perceived feminization of authority cannot be solved by adopting a religious framework whose global power structure is hostile to European interests. Genuine renewal requires confronting the post-1945 secular liberal order that disarmed Western societies, not importing a rival universalism that historically subordinates converts of European origin. The true enemy is not Christianity in its essence, but the ideological complex that neutered it, the fusion of consumer capitalism, therapeutic morality, and guilt-driven universalism that turned churches into social service agencies and nations into economic zones. Reclaiming older, harder strands of Western tradition, whether the martial Christianity of the Crusades and Reconquista, the Stoic republicanism of Rome, or the ethnic particularism of pre-modern Europe, or forging new ones compatible with group survival, offers a more honest path than surrendering to a hierarchy that has never concealed its contempt for those it conquers. This is not merely a theological question. It is a question of civilizational continuity and power. Every historical example of mass European conversion to Islam, Bosniaks under the Ottomans, Albanians in the Balkans, Circassians after Russian conquest, ended with the converts occupying a subordinate position within a polity dominated by non-European elites. Only the disintegration of the imperial structure granted them autonomy, and even then within diminished territories. The pattern is consistent. The privileges of conquest and polygamy accrue to the core ethnic groups, while converts serve as frontier muscle, propaganda assets, or disposable auxiliaries. To imagine that 21st century conditions have mysteriously dissolved these dynamics is to ignore the marriage patterns, mosque hierarchies, and private discourse observable in every major Western diaspora community today. Ultimately, the choice is not between a supposedly enfeebled Christianity and a virile Islam, but between recovering agency within one's own civilizational matrix and volunteering for subordinate status in another's. The historical record leaves no doubt which option has served the long-term interests of European peoples when they still possessed the will to assert them. The task is not conversion, but reassertion, political, cultural, and if necessary, martial, on terms that place the survival and flourishing of one's own posterity first. This requires dismantling the legal and cultural mechanisms that penalize family formation, re-establishing male authority within the home and polity, and cultivating institutions that reward sacrifice rather than punish strength. Only when Western men once again see their own tradition as a living source of power rather than a museum piece will the temptation to borrow someone else's sword lose its fatal allure. The future belongs not to those who change religions in search of masculinity, but to those who rebuild the conditions under which masculinity can once again be exercised without apology. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News Podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, And tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News, and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Remember to keep it real free news, and we'll see you next time.